The election's nearly over, and some might say it's been almost dull. But with the polls about to open, this seems like the best time to look back on how it's gone. I'm here with ALCA President-elect Jan Nedvidek, co-chair of the Labour Club, Madalena Leao, and co-chair of OULD, Matt Sumption. Let's start with the Conservatives, whose strategy, apart from repeating the words long-term economic plan over and over and over again, seems to have been sort of bigging up the SNP and implying that a Labour government would have to be supported by Nicola Sturgeon and therefore would endanger the union. Madalena, do you think this is an accurate representation of what would happen if Ed Miliband were PM?
Okay. So, is it that? Okay. I mean, I think that's probably not entirely accurate. Obviously, the SNP will have probably will have a number of seats, but with Labour, I think Labour are very aware of the political problems of working in hoc with the SNP. I also think the SNP don't have that much political clout in that they can't, having sort of promised that you vote SNP, you get Labour, they can hardly hold Labour to ransom and say, no, we're going to vote you out on the tiniest thing.
Jan, aren't the Conservatives sort of promoting English nationalism almost here?
I'm sorry, I think the representation is entirely accurate. I mean, the polls are suggesting, no one is even pretending to believe that Labour can have a majority. Everyone has been saying that Labour can only get in power with the SNP supporting them. And I think the idea of this country being run by people who want to break it up and split it in two, is quite frankly quite scary.
You say that the country be run by the SNP. Can you give an example of legislation that the SNP might try to push through?
Whatever the Labour government will want to do, they will have to rely on the SNP. The SNP can withdraw their support, and they can put their terms and conditions forward, and they say, unless you do this and that, we will not support you.
But maybe just one specific example.
Trident, for example. They want to get rid of Trident. I mean, the backbone of our national defence.
So if legislation came through, if Labour tried to pass, say, a motion to expand Trident, the SNP presumably would vote against it, but surely the Conservatives would vote for it, and then it would pass anyway.
I mean, of course, we've had some constructive cooperation from the two parties, when it comes to foreign interventions, etc., etc. Of course, we would support Trident, but when it comes to things like, giving even more money to Scotland, things like, depriving the British people a say on UK's membership of the European Union, etc. These are all things the SNP would do.
But again, surely the Conservatives could vote against these legislation.
Well, I mean, it would depend on what specific legislation Labour would put forward. What I am trying to say is that Ed Miliband will not be Prime Minister if he loses his confidence vote, and he will only win his confidence vote if the SNP support him. I think that's very clear.
Okay, thanks. I mean, Matt Sumption, what do you think of all this?
Well, I think probably the point is saying that we're no longer in a two-party system. It's definitively a multi-party system. Whatever happens in the next election, no one, even though the politicians will keep saying, we're striving for an outright majority, as Jan was alluding to, no one's going to get that outright majority. So people are wondering, okay, how are these coalitions or negotiations going to come about? With regards to the SNP, I share kind of the fear that the SNP would be able to hold the whip hand over the rest of the parties in the United Kingdom. I think, and you wouldn't be surprised if I said this, I think it's good to have as many Lib Dem MPs in Parliament because we've generally been a reasonable moderating force on the influence of the Conservatives and on Labour, as well as putting forward, liberal values throughout this government. So I think that, whatever happens, and it's going to be quite a fragmented outcome, you need to have parties that are willing to work together, not keep, saying how we're not going to work together. And I think that's what the Liberal Democrats have been trying to do.
Labour's election strategy has been a bit harder to pin down. It could be characterised as a sort of Barack Obama-style hope strategy. Really what it's seen as Ed Miliband move to the left. Jan, do you think Labour can really ever win a majority without centre ground?
I think, it was seen, that's what Blair did, in 1997. He moved a party through the centre. I think it's perfectly clear that in Britain, elections are won in the centre. And I think Ed Miliband probably finds himself in an extremely uncomfortable position because his natural inclination, is hardcore, proper socialism. His PR people and his spin doctors keep telling him to move to the centre. But now he's got the Greens, he's got the SNP, moving him further to the left. I think he must find himself in a very awkward position at the moment.
And it's true, we've seen him criticise New Labour and criticise Blair. Madalena, do you think it's kind of difficult for Labour to be in this kind of middle ground?
I think often the complaints that you hear on the doorstep, if anything, are that parties aren't differentiated enough. So up to a point, Labour going, as it were, slightly more to the left and providing a real choice between, a sort of a neoliberal form of economics and a more democratic socialist option isn't, I think, necessarily a problem. I think, if anything, if we were to look at just how Labour were doing in England, if it weren't for the Scottish question, it's not sort of appealing, not fully appealing to the middle ground, hasn't been that much of a problem. But I mean, as it is, I think, with focuses on the squeezed middle in the past and so forth, it's not that Labour has moved away from the middle classes at all.
But isn't there also this sort of inner conflict between Ed Miliband criticising previous Labour governments? Isn't that difficult for Labour?
I think up to a point there's always some form of difficulty. Parties want to say that the governments they had were always in the right and always did the right thing. But I think anyone can look back on the record of the Labour Party, sort of whatever political persuasion you are, and find something that you didn't agree with. And I think up to a point there's a good level of honesty in saying, no, we made a mistake here, we made a mistake there. And I think the electorate appreciate that.
Okay. Matt, I suppose in previous years, the Lib Dems have been the sort of left of Labour protest vote for Labour voters who didn't quite feel Labour represented them.
I think that's true.
Whereas now,
insofar as from 1997 to around 2005, because Labour was so centrist, then for the Liberal Democrats to be distinctive, then they had to pitch themselves somewhere else. And so that was to the left of Labour. That was a protest thing against Iraq, in favour of higher education spending, things like that.
Are you worried you're losing those voters now to Labour?
Well, sure. I think as soon as we went to coalition, the Lib Dems were going to lose some votes, right? So if we'd gone, if the arithmetic had worked for a coalition with Labour, then we would have lost lots of our voters in the southwest, lots of our voters in kind of marginal constituencies in kind of Norfolk and places like that. So it's not the case that Lib Dems were just a kind of naturally left-leaning party. There's quite a lot of people within the Liberal Democrats who are kind of instinctively moderate on economics, but would not be comfortable with being conservative. So we would have lost those voters if we'd gone in with Labour. I think now, even though it's true that we lost a lot of our vote share, I think a lot of that vote share was not very solid anyway. Whereas being in government, I think, what's the point of having a political party if you're never prepared to go into a government and put your ideas into practice? Now, that's obviously a hard sell when the government does difficult things, as this government has had to do. But I don't think that any Lib Dem should really be ashamed of the coalition of saying that, you believe in something, you want to get it through, you've got an option to get it through, and you do that, rather than saying, we're going to stay back, we're going to, just rest on our laurels and be a party of protest like, the SNP or UKIP or the Greens.
Well, exactly, and it seems as good a time as any to move on to the Lib Dems strategy, which has sort of been, as it's predicated on a hung parliament, which does seem very likely, of course, and, they say they're going to be the heart of the Conservatives and the brain of Labour, with this kind of Wizard of Oz imagery. Which one's Nick Clegg in the Wizard of Oz?
I'm not going to answer that particular kind of analogy, and I'm sure the heart and brain thing doesn't refer to anyone on this panel here. But I think the key thing is, look. We, as you said, it's very likely there's going to be a hung parliament. I don't think all the academic forecasts go for that. So it's how is that going to work out? And you've got many parties that are kind of competing for votes. As I was saying, you've got the Greens, you've got the SNP will have a significant number of seats. And then you will have a significant number of Lib Dems. I think we probably will return somewhere between 25 and 30 MPs. And those MPs are still going to, work for something, for a clear plan of government and putting into place things like, 3.5 billion for mental health, or 5 new green laws, or protecting education spending. So I think that's what we're setting out, and that's what we're saying. I don't think most British people, as Jan was saying, elections are won in the centre. I don't think most British people really want to have a kind of extreme government of right or left. They want something that's reasonably moderate, and I think that's what we're offering. I do think that we should have a positive message as well as just being, the different, split the difference party. I don't think that's quite fair, but I think because of the nature of political campaigns, this is our kind of message.
Yeah.
So I think that's how we've done it. We'll see how it goes tomorrow.
It's certainly a bit risky, isn't it? Sort of predicating on very much electoral strategy and sort of tactical voting. I mean, Madalena, do you think people really vote with this kind of coalition future in mind?
I definitely think that's just a big mixture. There are people who are not happy to vote tactically. There are people who will vote with the party that they believe in. But there are people, and you can see it even sort of where I'm living in Oxford West, there are people who are considering voting Lib Dem to keep the Tories out. And people do think about that. So I think it works for some, but not for all, is what I'd say.
Okay. I mean, in some ways, it's possibly the wrong way around. I mean, recently, Conservatives maybe haven't shown the brains with their unfunded NHS pledges, and maybe Labour don't show their heart with their kind of immigration policies, stigmatising people. What do you think about that, Jan?
I think there's some truth in that. I mean, I do find it fascinating that, on the one hand, Labour students at Oxford keep talking about how much they love immigration and, how immigration is great. And I agree with that. You may not know this, but I'm an immigrant. But of course, the party is officially running on an anti-immigration platform in this election. Look, I mean, let's be honest, all parties have been getting desperate, have really been trying to reach out. And, I'm sure that some, silly things have been said. But I think ultimately the message that the two main parties are offering are very clear, and I wouldn't like this, this sort of pre-election debate to be hooked up on a couple of things that a couple of people may have said in the past couple of days.
Okay, and maybe just to close it off, final predictions, including all permutations. What do you think? How do you think the government?
So I think the most likely thing is that the Conservatives will have most seats, but they won't be able to pass as Queen's Speech. Then we'll go into a period of intense negotiation and kind of spin between the SNP, Labour and the Liberal Democrats to try and pass this Queen's Speech, and I have no idea how that's going to work out.
It's very honest.
I think whoever tells you they know what's going to happen tomorrow is lying to you. I do think that the scenario of us being the largest party is very likely. Now the question is whether we will have enough seats with the Lib Dems, perhaps, with the DUP, potentially with UKIP, to put together a majority. But I do suspect there might be an imminent election, perhaps in autumn or indeed next spring.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to agree with the other two in that it's impossible to predict. There are lots of variables. If I were being hopeful, I'd say Labour will have more seats than the Tories and will form some form of power-sharing agreement or something like that. But I think we're going to be waiting a long time to find out what's going to happen.
It seems that even though the polls open tomorrow, we've got at least another few weeks left of arguing about who should run the country. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.